Welcome back to Call Me by Your Game, the podcast where I, your host, Connor McCabe, bring on a guest to hear from them about a meaningful video game from a particular moment in their life. On the show, you'll know I talk to my guests as much about what made playing that game special and also get into the context of how and when they had this meaningful time with it in the first place. You are listening to Co-op episode 51, where I'm going to be discussing with a group of people today the game Psychonauts 2. As you'll know, the co-op series is different from the regular podcast that I do, where I bring on a group of people to do an overview on one game at a time. For this year, in 2024, when this is releasing, I've had a theme of sequels. Most of them have been very clean sequels, like the one I'm discussing today, which is literally the second game, technically third, in a series. But I've also done some funny stuff where I'm going to be talking about a third entry in a game later this year. We've talked about a couple of big meaty DLCs as sequels, so I kind of fudge it how I really feel like. But last year for Co-op episode 41, we discussed Psychonauts, and today we're discussing Psychonauts 2. I couldn't be more excited. I've got an awesome group who's going to help me do that today. And if anything's wrong with them, I'm just going to slap a little door on their brain, go in and fix them up, and then we'll come back and do this podcast again. For anybody listening out there, the last bit of housekeeping before we get rolling on our discussion today is that wherever you're listening, whether it's on a podcast feed, which is going to be on Patreon, because this is a Patreon exclusive episode for audio format, or if you're watching this on YouTube a week after it debuts on Patreon, and you hear a plug you want to follow, whether it's a social media link, a video, another podcast, and you want to follow that, all links are going to be available in the show notes. So if you scroll down wherever you're listening or watching, you're going to be able to find that stuff there. That includes all the social media for the podcast, a link to our Patreon and all the other episodes we've done, our YouTube channel, all sorts of stuff. You can find it there. And that'll do it for the housekeeping. And I'll finally introduce our three brave Psychonauts who are going to be joining us for this episode, making his triumphant return for what is now his second co-op episode. Please welcome internet video guy Ryan Creamer.
Hey, thanks for having me.
You're gosh darn welcome, pal. So glad to have you. It just feels like yesterday we were doing that first Psychonauts episode.
So true.
Which we did. We'll talk about this a bunch because there's another guest on this episode who was on that as well. And it was 10 months ago that we did this. We also have another, speaking of returning guests from that episode, please welcome, let me make sure I get this right. I don't want to upset anyone. Please welcome to the microphone, internet video man, Tao Yang.
Thank you.
You're so welcome.
No, this is interesting.
Yeah.
Really, Tao. Now, correct me if I'm wrong. Maybe I'm misplacing this. This feels sort of just like a direct one-upmanship of me.
What are you talking about?
Yeah, it wasn't like a plan of mine or anything. I didn't get a message from someone on the Zoom to introduce them in a slightly beefed up way. But Tao, welcome back. Good to see you, buddy.
Good to see you.
We have one final guest to introduce, someone that I wanted on this first episode last year when we discussed the first game from 2005. It didn't work out, but folks, we got him. We got him. It's kind of like a new character getting introduced in this game. I mean, if I were to, let's pick a new character who's not in the first one. I don't know. I guess you're like Bob Zanotto or Helmet or Cat. Really anyone. Maybe one of the other Psychonauts in training like Norma. Welcome to the microphone, friend, human, video game maker, and internet video king, Nick Park.
Hell yeah.
Damn.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Connor. I'm super excited.
You're welcome, dude. So glad to have you back. Tao, on the last episode, because I did listen to the first hour of it last night, again, from 10 months ago, I really stumble over trying to remember all the co-op episodes that you've been on, and I can tell you right now all of them without stumbling through it. Are you ready for this, Tao?
Whoa, okay, yeah.
We have Celeste.
Uh-huh.
We have Ori and the Blind Forest.
Oh, yeah.
We have Psychonauts. We have now Psychonauts 2. And you want to know the funny thing? I'm definitely forgetting one. Ryan, this is your second co-op episode. Like I already said, you were on the Psychonauts episode last year, the co-op episode 41. Nick, this is your second one too, because we discussed, a little bit of relation to Psychonauts, but no direct correlation from people who worked on these games, unless I'm missing something somewhere. But we discussed Return to Monkey Island in 2022. Ryan, I know that you're a Psychonauts fan. Did you play that game? Because I want to feel like you probably did.
So I didn't play it growing up. I think I tried to use some software like Scum VM or something to play it recently, and I haven't gotten through it all. I played like Maniac Mansion and some other
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, but
Well,
I don't think I ever really played all of Monkey
Well,
Island.
Nick and I, we did an episode on the new one that they made in 2022, which is available on most platforms, I think.
Yeah.
Like, phenomenal game. Like, as far as someone who has a late nostalgia for the series, and by that I mean I didn't really know about it until essentially 2020. It's amazing stuff. But that's enough, talking about us today. We have a big task ahead of us, and that is to just discuss for everyone to hear our thoughts on Psychonauts 2. I want to start with our own personal histories with the series, but specifically Psychonauts 2 itself. Nick, I'll start with you because we didn't get to hear your history with the first game on the last episode. So walk me through how you came to play the first game, your history with it, and getting into experiencing the second one.
Great. Yeah, I played the first one, and when I was in high school, probably right around when it came out on PC, or pretty soon after. And it had been a friend's recommendation, and I haven't checked the statute of limitations on these things, so without saying too much, that friend may have pointed me at a link, and that link may have brought me to a game, and that game may have found its way onto my PC. And I had no idea what I was getting into and completely fell in love. Was so inspired by it and just have the fondest memories of the original.
I love it. Again, I kind of spoiled it a little bit earlier in a way, but you also were someone who grew up, we talked about this on Return to Monkey Island, that episode, but you grew up, being familiar with some Tim Schafer stuff, playing a lot of LucasArts stuff, and even you were also into King's Quest growing up, right?
Yeah, King's Quest was my first game, so I really was into adventure games already, and yeah, found all the LucasArts stuff a little bit later and loved that. Day of the Tentacle was such a favorite. And I think I really found a lot of that charm in Psychonauts 1 as well, which is what probably drew me to it.
I love that. Is Psychonauts 1 a game that you returned to after that first time you played it? Did you have kind of your one special moment with it?
Really kind of the one special moment with it. I've been trying to remember if I ever fired it back up, but certainly not in any recent history. I had great intentions to go do a playthrough before we all chatted, and I didn't.
Yes, you had, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but you had replayed 2 and then planned to replay 1 almost in a Star Wars prequel sort of order?
Yeah, that was the plan. Tactical Breach Wizards kind of blew up that plan, but in a very good way.
Cool. And then, when it comes to Psychonauts 2 for you, were you anticipating that game? When did you play it? Tell us about your history.
Yeah. I had been anticipating it the moment they, announced it. I was watching all the developer updates that Tim and the main character of the doc, arguably, we'll get into it, I'm sure, villain? Blank on his name now. Anyway, all the updates they were doing. And I was so excited for it. And the moment it landed on PlayStation, picked it up, planned my whole weekend around getting to sit down and play it.
Nice. And yes, I mean, somehow I don't know how I've missed that the whole time. Probably because we discussed it so much on the first episode, but I'm sure we'll talk about Psych Odyssey, the documentary about the making of this game. It was unavoidable on the first one, so now I don't know, maybe that's going to be all we talk about today. Nick, as we're sort of transitioning from talking to you to opening it up to everybody else, we've talked about this off pod plenty of times, and it's still so funny to me. But I came to you last summer, and I was like, Nick, you've got to check out this documentary that I'm watching. It's about the making of Psychonauts 2. It's so cool. Blah, blah, blah. I think you told me you liked the first game. And Nick was like, hey, Connor, I told you about this in February. So I had, honestly, being drunk at a friend's birthday, do not remember having this. I remember now having this conversation, but before he brought that up, I thought this was my own original thing I was bringing to Nick. Turns out he had already seen it all and was in love with it. And as we discussed on the first episode, I believe I introduced it to the two of you, even though you two had played this series before I had. And Ryan, I think you had already played part 2.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if I remember correctly. But so funny. They've now since come out with a penultimate, not a penultimate, a sort of
Epilogue.
An epilogue episode that Nick and I both watched, which is I don't think you need to see it to like have full context on the doc, but I think it is interesting and cool to hear them now debrief about stuff about watching their whole doc, which is it gets very snake eating its own head in a way. Mr. Creamer, we've talked a little bit about your history with the first game in the series. When it comes to Psychonauts 2, were you anticipating this game? When did you play it? Tell me a little bit about your time with it.
Yeah, so pretty similar to Nick. I didn't watch like the updates as it was happening because this was like a Kickstarted game, right? The second one.
It was
So
it was like Kickstarter or Fig or something at first.
Yes,
yeah.
yes. So it was definitely on my radar, and when it came out, I got it the day it came out and was very excited. Yeah, because I love the first one.
Awesome. Did you play it that one time? Had you come back to? I mean, it only came out 3 years ago, so this is a pretty recent history.
Yeah. Well, I don't know how much I want to get into. Well, so
sure.
I played it. I haven't returned it, and I also never finished it.
Ooh.
I got very much towards the end, and then was like, okay, I don't have any interest in continuing this.
Okay. I like I said, I cheated and listening to the first episode, the episode on part 1 last night. I have my guesses as to why that is, but we'll see. Thank you for sharing, Ryan. And then Teo. Oh dear, Teo.
Call me the heel because I'm not really a fan of the Tim Schafer games.
Oh, we went Teo, you not on every co-op episode, but you often your role and you fit in there so well. You are our dose of reality that we need oftentimes. It happened on Ori, it happened on the first Psychonauts episode, and it might be happening today too, but I know that you at least have some history with this game. When did you play it? Did you return to it for this? Tell us about it.
Yeah, same as Nick, the first one. Found the link somewhere.
Yes.
Probably on the website Supernova, which is now gone. The real heads know what that is. So yeah, played that. It was fun. I don't think I finished the first one, and then didn't really track the second one, and played it a little bit for our last co-op episode, and thought it was fun. But to me, the best thing that Double Fine has done is that documentary. I enjoyed it so much. It is one of the coolest, most interesting pieces of media that's been ever put out, I think.
Absolutely. I mean, I mentioned on the last episode, but I had already started watching it a second time, and now I just rewatched the whole freaking thing, because I felt like it. So
Yeah.
I've watched it 2.5 times. I've watched all their other stuff, like Double Fine Adventure, which is about Broken Age.
Yeah.
That's great, Teo.
And we can get into this later, but I also, the epilogue episode, I've been vindicated, I think, based on what I said in the last co-op episode.
I would say I've gone so back and forth on that. And so I want to save that maybe for like a separate section of this episode, because I think we could talk about it the whole time. But I'm curious to hear your thoughts too, because I've really just oscillated back and forth. As far as my history with this game, like I said on the first episode, I didn't even really know what Psychonauts was until 2020, 2021. Played the first game for the episode last year, loved it despite its flaws, and I find myself having just played it in about 7 sittings or so. I streamed the whole thing via Game Pass. I left this game feeling so similar to how I left the first game, which was mostly like just in love with like the spirit of the game. But there were plenty of things that I had to criticize. But overall, still overall loved it and definitely will revisit it. It got me. I know it didn't get everyone, but for me, it absolutely worked. And there's some things that I'm so pumped to get into the discussion of the comparison later, to talk about, because there are things that I think this game does a lot better than the first game. And then there are some ways that I think the first game triumphs over this. So I'm so pumped to talk about it. Let's do a little table setting for the listener about this game. Feel free to jump in, any of you at any time. Psychonauts 2 is I'll describe it as a sort of a Zelda-like adventure game with a 3D platforming sort of coat of paint. I mean, most people probably describe it as a 3D platformer, which I think is fair. But when thinking about the structure of the game, it's very Zelda of like, get this key so that you can go, or these 3 keys so that you can progress to this part of the game, rather than like a sort of Super Mario Galaxy or Astrobot where you have to get a certain amount of stars to get through something, but you don't have to get everything. This was developed by Double Fine and published by Xbox Game Studios. You can see it in the documentary Psych Odyssey, made by Two Player Productions, but this game had an incredibly tumultuous development cycle, just like the first one. History repeated itself. And the game was announced at the Game Awards 2015 ceremony with a quick trailer, and finally released on August 25th, 2021 for the PlayStation 4, Windows, Xbox One, and the Xbox Series X and S. And then the following May came out for Linux and Mac OS. It's not a game that's on Switch, perhaps for the Switch successor if we ever see it. This game was directed by Tim Schafer, who we've been talking about, and is sort of a prolific comedy writer of video games and game director, and the CEO of, I believe that's his title, is the CEO of Double Fine Studios.
I'll also add just like adult dramas with some celebrities, some stars in them. They don't make games like this anymore.
Yes. No,
they really don't.
Yeah.
Astrobot came out recently. I guess that's a similar kind of like platformer character game, but other than that, they don't really make games like this.
No, they don't. I mean, I think maybe that's why, like, I was talking to a friend about this yesterday, but that a 3D platformer feels like such a rarity, and anytime you get one, like, just because we never see them, my bar is lower. Like, and it's a discussion for another time, because I don't need to talk about Astrobot on this podcast, even though I did play these games back to back. There's many people who work on this game. This is one that I think, because we've all seen so much coverage of the development of it, it feels weird to gloss over the, I don't know, probably hundreds of people who worked on it, whether it's, the designers of Zach McClendon, who comes up a lot, is a huge figure in the doc, Seth Marinello, who ends up finishing the game as lead designer. There's also Peter McConnell, who's the composer, many voice actors like Jack Black, Elijah Wood, more voice actors that I'm not even naming. But this game, like the predecessor, the player controls Resputin Aquato, a young acrobat who is training to become a psychonaut, a member of an international task force that uses their psychic abilities to stop those that perform nefarious deeds with their own psychic forces. Within Psychonauts 2, this game directly follows the events of the first one, but also there's a VR game that takes place between these two called The Rhombus of Ruin. I have maybe 45 minutes of VR experience in my whole life, and this game did not fall into that 45 minutes. Has anybody played Rhombus of Ruin here?
No, my only sense of it is from watching the doc and seeing, I feel like, clips of it from that.
Yeah, it doesn't list here exactly when it came out. I want to guess 2018. I'll open up this it's February 2017, and then it came out like for other platforms in 2018. But the Rhombus of Ruin is essentially sort of like an interstitial story moment that takes us from the first game to the second game, where the Psychonauts are trying to learn, who is really behind the capture of their leader, unveiling it, and this sort of like opens up the deep mystery in Psychonauts 2, which is acts it's kind of similar narratively to the first one in that there is a bit of a mystery as to what's going on, but this feels way more like a sort of, kind of a classic. I compared it to Harry Potter in on the first episode, but another very much like a classic Harry Potter book where it's like the kids are going through their school and their lives, but there's one great mystery that they're sort of solving throughout the entire book. And this feels very similar. This game, unlike the first one, takes place at Psychonauts headquarters, the Mother Lobe, as they call it, where Raz's family is more involved in the game, who you had met, at least his dad at the end of the first one. I don't remember seeing anybody else from his family in the first game. Does anyone remember differently?
Yeah,
No.
I don't
His
think I
family's all like
remember.
circus performers.
Yes,
Yeah.
they're all circus performers.
He's
So
got like a Batman and Robin background. Like,
yeah, I was thinking of it sort of like he's got his own High School Musical thing going on, where like I guess being a psychonaut is the basketball and the circus stuff is the music. That comparison could be totally off, but
Well, yeah, but Connor, you do think that about everyone. You always tell me that everyone's kind of got a High School Musical thing going on, and I don't know if it always tracks.
yeah, I think even the first thing I said to you, like minutes into meeting you, I was like, you kind of got a High School Musical thing going on. So yeah, this game basically follows the mystery of uncovering. They know that there is a mole in the Psychonauts, and essentially the whole game revolves around trying to figure out who that mole is. It's a whodunit, essentially. This game was met with critical acclaim upon release from positive reviews from critics and fans. But this game also came with a heavy amount of anticipation, not just from the many delays that they had, but from such a passionate fan base of the first one with very high expectations. And it did pretty well for them after, especially they were acquired by Xbox, so it was a game that Xbox is really proud of. It was a Game of the Year nominee, blah blah blah, plenty of accolades. But as far as the history and context goes, do any of the three of you think there's some more context we should include before we move on to our discussion of the game? Okay.
Not for me, yeah.
oh, you covered it all.
Okay, Golden. I mean, there's truly so much to talk about. Getting into this game, Nick, I want to open up to you first. When you think about your time with Psychonauts 2, what is the first thing that sticks out to you, whether it's something positive or that's like eating at you about the game?
Yeah, I don't know if I could, nail it down to this one thing, but I think having just played through it recently, getting ready to talk about it, the real takeaway I had was when I played it the first time, I had all this anticipation. I was so excited about it. And I think I just came in with all this momentum from that. I liked the nostalgia and the excitement. And it was just so fun to be back in that world and playing. And then when I did the replay, I didn't have that. I was excited to chat about it, but was just looking at it more as a game. And, I think that really gave me a different kind of critical eye for especially early in the game, where I think it has some struggles and doesn't really hit the ground running. So yeah, I think it is, maybe my takeaway would be that it really lives and dies on its charm in a lot of ways. And you kind of have to be eager and excited for that, at least to get into it from the get-go.
Yeah, I think, and thankfully for the game itself, it really rides on that throughout the entire game. That I think is probably the greatest strength that it has, and it remains constant. I felt like for the most part, despite some peaks and valleys in the pace or the fun of the game itself, that's kind of what I go back to when reflecting on this game, is that it retains, for me, it retained a lot of the same spirit, which made it more engaging and fun for me to even play through the first one. Other things might have some more peaks and valleys for me personally, but yeah. Ryan, when we talked about the first game, the first thing that you brought up was probably the highlight and the most fun part about the game play itself, which is going into the brains. And in the first game, the way I might describe it is that as much as it's also kind of a whodunit where you're trying to get to, an end goal by going through different brains, this game does something that I think is a strength and also a weakness of the game, where instead of just thinking of kind of like the most fun brains that we could have, this game, I think, to its narrative strength, it ties them a lot better into the characters you're actually interacting with. But at times that might feel a little limiting as far as how spectacular these brains can be. What do you have an opinion on the brains in this game in particular? And if you want to compare it to the first, you can.
Yeah, totally. I mean, that's kind of my main takeaway, I think, in a negative way of this game, is that I think the plot to me, or the ballooning of the money and the money that went into this game, I think I can understand and empathize the desire then to be like, I'm going to create this epic. And to me, I want the game to be a revolving door of the most fun brains.
Yeah.
And I think often in this game, I'm getting plot. There are several brains that are just, this is a plot brain.
Yes.
And I think that gets in the way of what the game to me is the most fun, is just like, I also very like niche. I think the first game, you get more of a sense of the character before you get in their brain, or they're more of a caricature of, like, when you're going into basic braining in the first game, you're like, this is a guy who's dressed like a military guy. I wonder what his brain is going to look like.
Yeah.
And very frequently in this sequel, you're going into someone's brain that you've heard about through like text dialogue boxes, but like I don't really get a sense of who like Cassie is when I'm going into the Cassie brain. And I really think that for me in the first one, getting a sense of the cartoonish person beforehand, it was fun to think of what that brain could be.
Oh, sure, yeah.
And not having it, I was like, it's a small thing, but it's indicative to me of the larger feeling that I have, which is like, yeah, the brains weren't as fun.
Definitely. Yeah, there is, now that you bring that up, I hadn't considered that. There is a little less anticipation as far as like, what is this going to be like? I think too, in this game, I mean, I still think they did a pretty good job of variety. I would say personally, brain-wise, that the first game has much higher highs and much lower lows with the brains. There's a couple of those that, upon reflection, like I spoke kind of positively about the Waterloo brain, which is like the Napoleon one on the first episode. When I think about it, I don't like that one, and I don't like the play one. And I would say for this game, Psychonauts 2, personally, there was almost no brain that I didn't have fun in, but I don't think any of them, for me personally, reached the highs of like Milkman Conspiracy or the fish one, whatever that one was called.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have anything to say about that.
I also think, like, to that point, the second half of the first one is you're going to a mental asylum. You know what I mean? And
Yes.
I understand from a sensitivity perspective in a sequel to maybe shy away from that. But I remember that being like, even the idea that you're going to an island, to a mental asylum in a game where you're going to people's brains, being excited of like, oh my God, like, what are these brains going to be? And I think, yeah, I do agree that, but I kind of disagree in the sense of like the play and the Waterloo level, while gameplay wise, I'm sure if I were to replay, I wouldn't enjoy the play as much. I enjoyed seeing, like, in the mental asylum, in reality, this guy's playing this game, and it was funny to me that his brain was just like, how do I fucking win? Like, his whole mind is just the game. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, and not to like barge in, but
no, please.
I have very similar feelings where I feel like my memories of the first game, there was such variety even in what it felt like your goals inside a brain were, right?
Big time.
Like, yeah, they were all, I think, ultimately platformers, and and those things, but each brain felt really unique and kind of different from each other, and they were taking some wild swing with an idea. Whereas this one, it felt a bit more formulaic, right? Like artistically, they were spectacular and looked very differently. When it actually came down to like, well, what am I doing here? What's the kind of concept of this brain? It was often very kind of same one to the next.
I think I do agree with that. Whether you're going from like the mailman Ford brain or like not helmets necessarily, but who's in Bob Zanotto's brain, it does feel like you're kind of doing a similar thing. So much like I made a comparison earlier in the introduction of the context to the Zelda series, and I think that rings true because it like a lot of like every Zelda dungeon in the classic Zelda games are, even if like the sort of coat of paint is different or there might be a slightly different mechanic, you are doing the pretty much the exact same thing in all these dungeons. Again, I'm talking about that's my favorite series ever, so while I'm lending a critical eye to it, I still can enjoy that. But I think you're right, Nick. Teo, do you have any thoughts on the brains in this game, whether it's like a highlight of one you really enjoyed or something that was just eating at you?
I like well, it's cool to not to bring up the documentary again, but it was cool to see the cooking one go from like game jam to, oh, they fit this into this level.
Yes.
And I think that was probably like maybe the type of brain game that you guys are talking about that's missing, where there's not enough of like, because I think a lot of these platformers do, like Nintendo's really good at this, where it's like there's like the core gameplay loop, but in this level, you're doing this novel thing that is completely different from the most of the core gameplay loop that we only will do for this one level, and then you're back to normal stuff until you like the next level has some other crazy idea. And Psychonauts 2 compared to 1 has less of those types of levels where it's like the core gameplay loop is pretty good, but it's one of the things that gets stale really quickly.
Yeah.
And so they just don't have like as many like wild premises, I guess, for the brain. It's just like you're just doing your jumping, you know, all your different actions, but in a different cool drawn space.
Yeah. I think that's fair. I think that's pretty dang fair. It's funny, despite, you know, the what like what you described as sort of like a stale nature of like a similar gameplay loop and design for just like, I don't know if you would call them, gosh, I'm just regurgitating words from the doc. Does the term action pack or action path trigger anyone having watched this documentary? Something that Zach brings up a bunch, but I think despite that, I still like had a ball, and for whatever reason, like this also being my first playthrough, kind of couldn't put the game down and was like looking forward to getting back into it. Um, this isn't brain related, but it all ties in together. One, there's this something in this game which is a part of the first one, which is kind of the sort of open-ish area that we spend a lot of the game in, both of inside the mother lobe and outside the mother lobe, kind of in the gosh, I forget what it's called, where your family's hanging out in
The questionable area.
the questionable area. There's a couple other small spaces to sort of explore. That when it comes to the game, outside of needing a few like crucial story beats to progress and essentially keys to get, there's not a lot of, it didn't feel that integral to me to this game. That said, I must have been a prisoner of the moment because I love just like dicking around in a big 3D platforming space and seeing what I can get to. Can I get to that Psych card? Can I get to that core over there? Did you guys have any opinions on this sort of bigger space that is kind of, I guess, similar to the campground in the first one? Maybe Nick, I'll turn to you.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think a strength of the first game, for me at least, was that setting. And it just felt really, I don't know, true to itself, right? It's like it's a psychic summer camp. And man, it felt like what I imagined a psychic summer camp would be. And I almost feel like they kind of dropped the ball here because the Mother Lobe and the idea of like Psychonauts headquarters is cool. And I think they do a pretty good job putting that together.
Mm-hmm.
But then the rest of that open world doesn't kind of connect with me and the tropes of like, what is a spy headquarters, right? A spy headquarters isn't, the nature area and campground next door. And it feels like maybe they were trying to juice the nostalgia of people want to be back in that kind of Psychonauts 1E environment. We're going to take advantage of that. But especially on my second playthrough, like I barely spent any time over there. It's like, it's not really necessary. It didn't really like fit the vibe of the game. I think they kind of missed an opportunity to really play with the setting in a successful way.
I was
it did feel like a checkbox kind of thing of like, we need an open world. We're making a game in 2020. We need an open world.
Right.
I think so. Were you going to say something, Ryan?
No, I mean, I agree. I also just look at it as like a resource. The more resources that went into that, I think were taken away from the thing I want. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So like as a set piece, I love that waterfall, but I also have like a worm in my brain with these games where I want to collect the things, and the bigger the space is, the more arduous it starts to feel.
Mm-hmm.
And the scale of the first game being small and the worlds being small, the figments, in retrospect, sure, they were annoying, but at least it was a small enough box that you wouldn't waste an hour like scouring it. So I do think I agree with Nick.
I was so overwhelmed by the collectathon of everything that I was like, once it's like there's 3,000 of these, I go, okay, I'm never getting any of these.
Totally. Yes. Right. And I think that's healthy.
Yeah.
Definitely.
That's something that this game did not shake from the first one, because I think the first one has a similar thing going on where and this game does it in a different way where like the things that you collect all do contribute to the more like RPG nature of this one, where you can upgrade unless I'm forgetting something about the first, where you can quite specifically upgrade your psi powers sort of level by level, and you can choose which ones you upgrade. All of the collection stuff goes into that same pool. But even doing that, I was like, this also feels like something that's being done because they think it should be done, or like they're not necessarily, I don't know if characterizing it as padding is fair, but maybe it is kind of similar, akin to the questionable area. I still interacted with all of it. I like wanted to find everything I could. I didn't end up going back after I completed the game to like find the last crap that I just didn't collect. But yeah, no, I think that a lot of what you're sharing is fair. You talk about setting, Nick, and I, at first, when getting dropped into the Mother Lobe, after the first brain, which like I thought was really, really fun being in what's the Labata, Labata, yes. First of all, I love the bait and switch of the intro of the game where I'm like, wait a second, this is what being a psychonaut is like, it's just like all cubicles and stuff, and then you find out you're in his brain and trying to find out, extract from him who's put him up to all of this bad stuff. Intro aside, getting dropped into the Mother Lobe, I was really fascinated by it and kind of like, wow, this is so cool to see this like big open area. Like my brain was spinning as far as like, who else works here? Like, what do they all get up to? What's like off limits as a psychonaut and what's fair, which they get into a little bit with some of the characters. And then Nick, I think you're right about them wanting to, I guess, like wring a little nostalgia out of people, because when I did get to the campground area, being a prisoner of the moment, I was like, oh, I did miss the outdoors, in a video game. But yeah, I don't know. Did everyone get to share what they thought about the sort of setting of actually going from, being at the psychic summer camp to the actual like main the Psychonauts headquarters that we heard about in the first game?
I think oh, go ahead.
No, please.
I think as a game, it's from like a game design thing, it's tough for them where they have to like there are clearly things that are put into the game that are like for hardcore fans of Psychonaut 1. And so I think they do need to put in like nostalgia for the camp and stuff, and also like, optional collection things so you can like really 100% and explore every nook and cranny of it. Which is also, I guess, but at the same time, for like people who are just like kind of playing the game maybe for the first time, playing the second one only, like doesn't make it. I those decisions, I guess, kind of clash with the experience for those types of players, which is like an interesting like trade-off.
Yeah. Ryan, were you gonna say something on that same subject?
Oh, and just in remembering the start of the game, which I agree, I really like the part where it is like a cubicle.
Yes.
Genuinely, like in the first playthrough and in revisiting it, I was like, this is so funny. I remember like being so like, oh man, the tone is here and like it's back. And I really think the first level is a great level, but I also remember being a little bummed that it wasn't. I think it's narratively such a fun choice to be like, this thing that Raz really wanted is like, oh, this is actually kind of boring and like sucks.
Yeah.
That was the only thought I had.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. What if they would have gone down that route, is like that's not just a fake reality that they've sort of built for Lobato to trick him.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Nick, were you gonna say something? I saw you just nodding along so joyously.
Yeah, I think Brian's comment hit so home for me. That's the fun of, show me what a true spy headquarters is like. And it's such a funny take on it to be, oh, it's paperwork, right?
Yeah.
And they had that idea and they kind of just didn't actually stick to it. And instead, you have the mother lobe and there's tons of people who seemingly their job is to wander around the lobby, right? It's like
tons of Muppets.
No other space for them to be or go. It just doesn't, there's something really rewarding to me in a game world where there's like some internal logic to it, where I can look around and be like, I know it's a game, but I can imagine what's going on here. And I just don't think they had it.
Yeah, interesting. There so much just thinking about this game, because I've been just giving it a lot of thought since I finished it. Having finished this game and rewatched the documentary, I am just blown away at how much of history repeated itself, not even just the development, which is so obvious when you watch that. It's like a whole like focus of the doc, but just the game itself. I'm so amazed at, like, from 1 to 2, how many like strengths remained and how many like issues remained too. One thing we haven't talked about too much is the gameplay and sort of like locomotion, which both from like the skill set of the player, but also the tasks that they have you do throughout the game. And I think in one way that I personally felt like this game was significantly better is the gameplay, both from a clunkiness standpoint and just even the abilities that you have in this one. While I think some of the same issues remain of like, there are too many abilities to juggle most of the time, despite we had this whole discussion on the first episode of like our go-tos. Like, Nick, since I maybe didn't, I wouldn't have turned to you because you weren't on that one. Do you have like go-tos as far as the skills in this game? Do you map them to certain buttons? Do you swap a certain one out as your wild card? How does that work for you?
Yeah, I did. I don't think I remember, exactly my, my build, but yeah, I definitely felt that. Like, there's a bunch to juggle, and you kind of end up picking a few that work for you.
Yeah, I think like the first game, I abused the heck out of levitation, of rolling on the ball, and had so much fun timing out. If I was making like a long distance jump or a jump that had like a deep fall where you could get fall damage, I had a lot of fun with like waiting till the last second to use levitation, which just has a pretty short lifespan when you're in the air, of like when you sort of hang on the ball. I did a lot of that. I loved some of the stuff they introduced. I liked, like the mental connection of essentially what is kind of like your hook shot around certain areas, certain thoughts that are in the air. I enjoyed that.
Do you think this game is was built with the idea that you have like builds and like different players would have different types of builds, or is it just, it's not really built, it's just like we have too many abilities, you need to use all of them to get through different parts of the game. But I don't think it was built with like, this player is going to have this type of build and this player will have this type of build based on like your play style or whatever.
I think you're
not
correct.
At all. I think you're right, Tao. I think it was really much more of these abilities mapped to these enemies.
Yeah.
And so it's like a rock, paper, scissors thing of pick the right ability.
Right. And so it's just more like a chore to be like, all right, I gotta fight this enemy, and now I gotta go and pause and switch and remap my stuff, which is like kind of annoying. I guess it was also in the first one too.
Yeah, it's a little streamlined in this one, where we talk about in the first game wishing there was like a Horizon Zero Dawn or Red Dead Redemption 2 wheel where you could just hold a button and map to that, which they kind of have a version of that. It's just, it's not as streamlined as those. What were you going to say, Teo?
I was saying like I don't know why it like, is that a patented game design thing? You can't have wheels in game. You have to pay a license to have the wheel in the game.
Right. I have no clue, but speaking to what you two were talking about with the enemies and the rock, paper, scissors of it all. Yeah. And they get at that pretty early on. I think even in Lobato's brain, they introduce these like purple gunk monsters, and they tell you fire is effective against these. They introduce one, I forget what the enemy is called. It's like mental panic or something, where it moves too fast to where you have to use the like time slow mechanic, which I think the best mechanics in these games have a fun use in battle, but also are functional outside of it. That one, I think I could see an argument from someone where it's like, no, it's actually pretty limited what you could do outside, but I actually liked slowing down platforms or things to make it more accessible. I don't know. Did you guys have Ryan? I don't know if I had turned to you yet on the gameplay or the abilities. Is there anything you want to highlight or discuss?
Yeah, I feel like mapping it to Zelda is so true. You know what I mean? Going to any temple and getting an item or an ability and being like, in Zelda specifically, I think of Ocarina of Time and being like, in your first playthrough, excited going through the temple of, oh, I wonder what the item is going to be, and I wonder what like. And what's interesting about Psychonauts is, to me, I think they do a good job of like mental connection as an idea and being implemented as that. I really like, but I really don't play Psychonauts the same way I play Zelda. Like,
yes,
the excitement that I feel temple to temple in Psychonauts is exploring what the brain is, and whatever technique they have in the first, the Hollis like gambling casino hospital, I really like as a brain. But I remember feeling so disappointed that a lot of the mental connection implementation in that level is you largely go into like a Super Mario Sunshine like little platforming area that's disconnected from everything, and it doesn't have a sense of like, oh, I'm in a casino right now. It's just like I'm kind of in this weird void. And I remember feeling a little bummed because I'm like, oh yeah, it makes sense that I'm here to use mental connection, but I don't get the sense that I'm like in a casino that's also a hospital anymore. That's kind of what I want from Psychonauts, you know?
Yeah, that's interesting. Nick, did you have something that you wanted to add there?
No, I mean, I think I just agree again. It is the setting is what's so fun about it, and the concepts, and you know, the casino is a great example where the concept there is you're using mental connection to change the way her mind works,
yes,
right, and what she values. But they don't show you that. They tell you through some voiceover and stuff. But when I make connections and I finish one of those little, vault areas inside, I don't see the casino change. I don't see the effects of my action in the world I'm running around. Instead, I get a little cutscene and I get booted back out to go jump into the next part of the vault.
Okay, yeah, that's totally fair. There's some other elements I want to highlight, and if things come up too that you all are like, oh shoot, I wanted to talk about this brain or this secret or whatever, jump in at any time. Just to keep us moving, one thing that I wanted to highlight was, of course, the humor, which is like kind of almost goes without saying, which with this game. And kind of like the first one, I really was charmed by the majority of the dialogue writing, character design, which I think could be humorous too. Um, uh, so I wanted to turn to you all. Was there like a character highlight? Maybe I'll turn to Teo first. Did you have a character that stuck out to you, or like a moment in the game, whether it was funny or something narrative you wanted to highlight?
Nothing that because I think it's all pretty good, and to honestly would talk about Double Fine as a company is I think this is kind of like their secret sauce.
Yeah, definitely.
In the same way that and I kind of want to compare them to Naughty Dog.
Yes,
Where
it's so funny. You did this on the first
did I
episode
do
too.
this?
Yes,
I did. I already said
please,
this.
yeah. No, but please go ahead.
If Naughty Dog is trying to be basically make Steven Spielberg movies or blockbuster Hollywood movies as video games, I think Double Fine is trying to make Pixar movies as video games, in that they have a lot of, and I think I've been noticing this too a lot, maybe because I'm playing through Final Fantasy 16, and just feeling certain companies just don't put too much value in the overall, I want to say the pacing going from gameplay to cutscene, and maybe part of it too is just cultural differences too, and what they want in the way they play their cutscenes. But every Final Fantasy cutscene, I'm there's so much weird pausing and there's so much weird just the pacing of every scene is just 3 seconds too long. A cutscene will start and there'll maybe be 2 seconds of silence, and it's just the tightness of it. I think they really care about in games like The Last of Us Part 2, and also in Psychonauts 2, where it's just everything is fluid and cuts together really well, and it's the pacing of it, they clearly care about in the way you would edit a movie, is they care about every single line and how quickly you go through things, and nothing's awkward, and I think having all of your dialogue and all your cutscenes not feel awkward is probably incredibly difficult to do in a video game because there's so many moving pieces. But I think they clearly value that of making sure that everything just plays together well. Whereas Final Fantasy games, I'm there's just yeah, or even just optimizing how much time you go from gameplay to cutscene. There is sometimes a weird long pause that they're not very they're not optimizing for, which I feel games that do, companies that do value that, Double Fine and Naughty Dog, do all right, let's shave off and make sure that the transition to cutscene is instant, and also there's not weird assets loading in the background as the cutscene is playing, stuff like that. All of that is kind of their, what makes Double Fine really good at what they do.
Yeah,
I feel mentioning Pixar is such a good connection, because when you're talking about the humor of it, I do feel this one has lost the edge of the first one, not necessarily in a bad way, but it's so much more of a Pixar exploration. And the first one, whether it's going to the brains of mentally ill people, or just little side characters, you go and talk to them and be yeah, I'm trying to destroy blow up a squirrel with my mind. I found that to be a little less in this one.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm just misremembering, but I'm I felt less
incentivized. Right. It's gone woke.
Yeah, it's gone woke.
I do.
No,
I
know
was I'm less interested in talking to characters in the questionable area.
Yeah.
If I don't think I need the carrot of there's gonna be something funny here, and I don't think I was as incentivized in this game as I was in the first.
Yeah, I mean, to your point though, I think I'll add on to the comparison. If this game is a a Pixar translation of a movie to what a game could be like, then the first one feels way more like something like a Laika movie, where it is a little more gritty and edgy and dirty. This game still has plenty of that, and it's got plenty of gross stuff too. Whether you're in one of the 3 Ford mines and you go up and you're walking on his tongue again and you can see the specific taste buds, there's gross stuff like that. But I think you're right to where it may be just a product of an increased sensitivity to certain subjects, but also just like more polish and shine that's definitely on this first game, which in some ways I think is a benefit. Like I've been praising the gameplay in this one, and like the first one I would just ram my head against stuff is like because I enjoyed the spirit of the game and I wanted to see it through. This one there was a lot less of that for me. It was a lot more fluid and like things I felt like functioned the way they intentioned a lot better in this first game. But sorry, I kind of like skewed what we were talking about back into gameplay a little bit. Ryan, do you have like a highlight as far as like a piece of humor or like a character or a moment in the game you wanted to bring up?
Honestly, the start, I do think is so good. Like it's so good because it's so funny and it's so weirdly, like a specific thing it does really well is like tie a tutorial into gameplay in a very good way, I thought. Like, you know, burning the photos and chasing after Lobato. I really thought it was like well done and like concise. And to Nick's point, like starting out, I think your brain when you're starting Psychonauts is the most excited for the whole process because there's only like curiosity ahead. So I remember feeling very charmed and very like at ease in the first level. I also like the sort of like Ocean's 11 cutscene at a Hollis's brain or after Hollis's brain. I really thought that was like very fun. But I guess I wasn't like laughing. I was just like, oh, this is so cinematic and cool.
Sure.
Yeah, I don't know if I can pull like a great example of like the funniest moment to me.
There is a if you compare it back to Pixar, and I guess like the closest thing is Inside Out, even though Psychonauts came out way before Inside Out, so
yeah,
probably Pixar stole the idea from them. That like Pixar only has to do like 90 minutes, 100 minutes of stuff. So all of like the premise of like we're going inside someone's brain and everything is named and or like a reference to like some sort of psychology thing, you can like really have like your A+ material.
Yes.
For like a 90-minute movie, but for like a 15-hour video game, it's like, all right, I'm exhausted by like, oh, we're gonna call it like the cerebellum thing, like whatever,
Yeah.
Like all of like we're just like, okay, I'm exhausted by like you guys playing out this premise this much where it's like everything you can think of like goes in.
Oh, also, sorry. The answer is like Nick not having a brain at the start. That's the funniest. Like him being like his in the mailroom, his like getting squished and just keep saying TV. That's the funniest thing.
That is pretty good. But Teo, that's a good point though. Yeah, it's like a very curated, specific, like shot-oriented movie versus a game where you give the player freedom and they can interact and see way more detail than you would in a movie. I think that makes a lot of sense. Nick, did you have like a moment you wanted to highlight in the game, narratively or comedy wise or anything like that?
Yeah, I'd call out the like kind of amusement park ride when you go into, Crystal Malik's mind and they're singing the national anthem and you get this whole little tour of his history and his wants. It's just, it really hit great for me. Is it laugh out loud funny? I don't know, but it is funny and it is so charming and just like a delightful way to see that story told to you versus something that's much more cutscene heavy, much more dialogue driven.
Yeah, that one was the example I wanted to bring up too. I think partly because I've been very theme park pilled lately. I've had so much like Imagineering on the brain. I went back to Disneyland for the first time in a couple years last week, so it's been top of mind. So to go into, the villain of the game's brain and have it be sort of this propagandized version of his family's history, the way he views the world was so fun and funny. Kind of like there's hints of It's a Small World in there. There's dark ride stuff in there. I was very, very charmed by that. Speaking of which, something that I love about these types of stories is because I feel like I'm usually pretty bad at it, is I love to figure out like, okay, who do I think is actually the mole. What's the red herring here? Do you guys does anybody remember from their first playthrough if they had a beat on it, or if they were like, I don't know who the hell the bad guy is?
I think I had no idea.
Yeah.
Like I definitely didn't think it was what it was.
Yes.
Yeah.
They have like a twist at a certain point in the game too, where Zanotto, I think it's Bob Zanotto. There's two Zanottos, and I think it's Bob, Lily's dad, right? That's the guy who's like asleep for part of the game and is like, Raz, there's a mole. It basically, there were certain twists that threw me off that I actually got a lot of enjoyment out of. I'm also, I've said it before, I'm a prisoner of the moment. So if I just don't even see something coming, it doesn't even have to be that good. I'll still be impressed by it. I did have a thought early in the game because I was like, okay, there's got to be a red herring here. The obvious person is not going to be it. So I did think maybe it's Nick, but I was like, you know what? Nick doesn't have a brain. There's no way it could be him. And so I just kind of moved on from that idea. So for them to have that sort of weird roundabout way of it actually being Nick because his brain is in Bob's body, I enjoyed that and was satisfied about it. Other Nick, do you have an opinion on this?
Yeah. I don't remember from my first playthrough what I clued in on or not, and it had been long enough that I didn't like immediately remember everything this time, but picked up on the hints pretty quick. I would just say though that overall, honestly, the narrative and story of this game was great. I enjoyed it a lot. I think it didn't always succeed in how it was paced, but I think as you kind of begin to understand this full cast of characters, you understand the plot. I think that like overarching plot was really awesome, and I just enjoyed it a ton. I enjoyed the discovery. I enjoyed the kind of resolution of getting to see this group of friends that have been fractured come back together. Yeah, I think it was a strength of it for me.
That's cool. Yeah. I've got some stuff I want to say about it too, kind of echoing a lot of what you said. But Ryan or Teo, do either of you have an opinion on the narrative or anything you want to share about that element of this game?
Too many characters.
There are a lot of characters.
There's too many characters. I'm also the kind of a video game player I am. I'm very much like almost oblivious or forgetful of like the overarching story. And I'm like in the moment I'm like, okay, I know what's happening, but like I'm like I got like 3-4 hours in the game, but like who's Bob Zanotto and what is he and what is he who?
That was me in the first game. I mentioned it on the episode, but I forgot that Raz was even an acrobat and had like a family until we got to the end of the first game. So I'm like, that happens to me too.
Yeah, I feel like I'm more of the camp of like, make it Mario, make it Link. Like there is one bad guy, you know what I mean? Like that's maybe not fair in all cases, but I'm just like the simpler to me. I'm just not in it, and specifically Psychonauts for like getting juked plot wise. Like it's not that important to me. Yeah, so I can appreciate it from a storytelling perspective, but it was I just felt I think a little annoyed by it sometimes, where I'm just like, man, I wish I wasn't going in 3 forward mines. You know what I mean? Like I see that as such a loss of real estate.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, it's funny. Like at Nick, I said, I'm probably going to echo a lot of what you said, which is like I really enjoyed the narrative and how they were able to tie I felt everything together pretty well. And especially with like one thing as we were going through the game that I was like, I don't know if they're going to have this element was like the sort of heart. Like obviously there was the mystery, but I'm like, I just don't see them making this feel like as like heartfelt as the first one, or tying it into all of the main characters at least, and Raz and his family, kind of like how they do in the first one with him on a much smaller scale. But by the end, with like the bad guy getting revealed, and how Raz's family is tied to all of this and the history of the Psychonauts and the destruction there, I was like along for the ride, and I kind of really loved it and was impressed. I will say too, Ryan, I was like feeling kind of how you were feeling near the end of my playthrough. I think on stream I even said on like the I think the eve of like Astrobot coming out, I said something along the lines of I'm really looking forward to playing a gameplay focused 3D platformer rather than a narrative one. And now, having also finished 15 hours of Astrobot, I left. I think I just like leave experiences wanting the other thing that I don't have because I finished Astrobot, which I really liked. I don't think I like it as much as most people, but I would. It's like a 9 out of 10 for me. Sorry. I definitely there was like something I felt was missing personally.
Well,
But
the story of Astrobot is how freaking awesome Sony is.
Okay, and now I'm oscillating back there. But kind of like, miss like wanting to play I say this in like Super Mario 64 barely has any narrative. So Galaxy has like a little bit of it, and those are my favorite sort of style of 3D platformers. So, um I find myself oscillated all the way back to like, gosh, I love the heart and the narrative of this game. And even with all the clunky crap in it, like it still really did it for me personally.
Totally.
There are very few games that I play and actively am engaged with the story
Yes.
that's going on. Like it is Naughty Dog games, mostly just Last of Us. Or I guess the BioShock games. I was pretty engaged in this, mostly BioShock Infinite, more so than the other ones. But because I just think most game stories they just end up being really beholden to like them being a game first.
Yeah.
And it just makes like the smaller indie games, like where it's much more story focused. Those are like I'm much more engaged in the story, but like kind of the bigger ones, it's like, yeah, you have to write a really engaging story, but you also have to like pad it out with like an extra 6 hours of gameplay and narratively make work like you getting a bunch of like chickens or whatever, collecting like whatever garbage.
Yeah. Nick, do you have any opinions on this before I've got a question I want to kind of open up to everybody?
No, I think I agree with a lot that's been said.
Cool. This is again like the first game to the second, like the development of the first to the second, and like our first podcast to this one. There are just recurring things that keep coming up. And one of the things we discussed on that episode was what is the best format for like what they're trying to do here? Like, is it a 3D platformer? Is it a cartoon animated series? Like, what is it? Because I don't know what the answer to that is because I love sort of I love this gameplay and the 3D platformer, but the clunkiness is something that is really hard to ignore. This may not even be a question we have an answer to today, but is this something that anybody else has been thinking about, revisiting this part 2 of this game anymore?
That's a good point. Like, I guess I've never thought about that because I've only ever engaged with it as it is, you know what I mean? But like drawing the comparison to Harry Potter is like, oh, the building blocks are here for like a big franchise. I feel like it's something that is very similar to Harry Potter and it just captures the imagination of such a fun thing. Where like, yeah, I could see it as like a fucking, I don't know, at least animated series, if not like a Harry Potter movie franchise. Yeah, that's a good question. I really just hadn't thought of it. I've always just been like, yeah, this is a game.
I wonder if that would lend itself to your love of the brains more of like every episode is just like it's just a different brain and we're spending very little time outside of it for the most part. I don't know.
Totally.
I do think platformer is probably the best game genre for this. I guess because like there was something about like you create a premise for a brain, but it also has to be within the confines of a jumping around and exploring a space. Because it could be like a visual novel type game or I mean, it could just be, and this is back to my man Zach, where I think that a lot of the friction in the documentary when he was around was the quality of the combat systems in the game. And to me, it's like they could have gotten rid or significantly simplified the combat, or go all the way and make it like a lot more combat focused, like either one. And I feel like Zach was trying to go the other way of okay, we're gonna have combat, we should like make it really good. And I think the combat in the game is like somewhere in the middle.
Yeah.
Where they're like, they try to add some stuff, they try to make all this like the rock paper scissors combat of like the enemies, but it's like, I don't know. I actually, when I was playing it, I set the difficulty to like as easy as possible, because I just like didn't even want to really. I was like, I don't want to have to like, I don't want health bars on these enemies.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Was someone going to say something? Maybe not. I'll just jump in. The combat, as much as I was praising the gameplay, Tao, I completely agree about the combat in this game. It's similar to the first one too, where I like felt like I had a really great grasp of like what abilities served me well in different moments, but I still was mostly doing the same thing of like, oftentimes the challenge was just like you'd be overwhelmed by 8 or 10 enemies, and so I would essentially like, do the same crap of like make my fireball as big as possible to light as many of them on fire, and then I would spam the like, I forget what the Psy Blast might be the name of the projectile. I would do that and then maybe use the time stop thing to just whack. But there's very few enemies in this game that I think challenged you to consider really how they are functioning. That one I referenced one earlier of the speedy like mental thing, but there's a judge in this game too that you have to attack a certain way. So they like, it's kind of like a half measure, I feel like, that was done in this game. And I wouldn't say I don't like it, but I wouldn't say that it's like great combat by any means, kind of living in that middle ground that Tao was talking about. Nick?
Yeah, I totally agree on the combat. I think to the earlier question of, how would you want this game or this world to be explored through a game? Yeah, for me, and I'm a big dork, but I wish they leaned more into the puzzle part of the puzzle platformer, because I think that what is, again, so fun about these worlds is like you're going into these brains and changing them and having to figure out like what's going on here, how can I influence it? And I think just leaning into that more would be a more delightful way to get to kind of play around and explore it and enjoy the exploration of the brains versus kind of the annoyance of like, no, great, kind of these sensors just dropped in my head and it's not going to be fun to fight them.
Yeah, I had the feeling of whenever it was sort of a cutscene of like, oh no, I think I'm gonna have a panic attack. I was like, God fucking damn it. Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah. Or maybe.
Sorry, go ahead.
No.
I just, in general, in talking about this, it's like solidified it to me, is it really feels like this sequel is like a really cool indie band that is like, we gotta make pet sounds. It's like, well, if you try to make pet sounds, you start to lose like what makes your shit cool. And maybe it's an issue of like, a ton of money being involved, or like essentially it being funded before it's been created and the pressure that creates. But it's like, when you think you need a really cool combat system because you're a video game, it's like, well, I don't know. Like, I don't think that's what anyone was really hyped on when you made it the first time.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Yeah, it's probably something I'm gonna go like back and forth on, but you two, I think maybe Tao said something about this too, but Nick and Ryan specifically, you're bringing up a really interesting point. Like, what if, it was just approached so differently? And Nick, you bringing up this puzzle nature of it all, I think when the few times they lean into that in this game, and especially the first, it's really strong. Like, I think the Milkman conspiracy, despite some of its clunkiness, I think that was an example of one of those that does that really well, of sort of figuring out, kind of like in a Hitman way. And Nick, some stuff that we've talked about with making a game is like the different costumes of it all, of like what works where, how do I even get to this point to use it? So yeah, there's a lot that's great. There's other elements of this game that we don't have to dive into super deep, that I find sometimes talking on podcasts about like whether it's voice acting or music, it can be hard to articulate of like, oh yeah, it was good. But one thing I'll just sort of bring up here to sort of clean up some last elements for us is the music, which like I just love by Peter McConnell. This is a composer that I've come to really adore as I like, the last couple of years have played a few games that he has composed music for, like Grim Fandango, and in particularly this series, I just loved. And that's one element that like really made me feel like at home with this series. I don't know if anyone had anything they wanted to bring up musically about the composition, whether it's a favorite song or just like an overall thought, but I kind of wanted to open up to you guys. I even hear music playing right now. That's the cool thing. It's like, while we're all thinking, I'm hearing the music. But it is a tough thing to talk about on pods because, like, especially as not a musician, articulating that is tough. But Ryan, I kind of cut you off there.
No. It's not top of mind to me. Like, I didn't have like super connected. I've really loved the art style. I think
thank you.
The visual of it is something that I've really liked, and I think they maintained it well or updated it and kept the like integrity of like how it looks. And but to answer your music question, I don't know if I have a specific like, oh, this super connected with me, but the art I've always really been drawn to.
That's cool. Well, I mean, I'll like turn to you. I don't know if you had more to say about it, but I'll echo and say that, yeah, I love the art style too. This sort of like crunchy puppet, like claymation looking art style is so great. I love how they designed so much of this world. And as much as I might have some criticism of the brain structures and how they're sort of working, I like ate all that stuff up. I thought it was so well done. The one weird thing, I made a joke about it earlier with this, is that I don't know if this was a thing in the first game, but so many of the like employees at the Mother Lobe, they look like just Muppets to me. Like, it was kind of jarring. Did anybody have the same thought or any opinions on that?
There's definitely some that there's one guy I'm thinking of specifically who has like eyes like this. I think he's like the ride operator.
Yes.
On the yeah, he is like the most Muppet looking MFer of all time. Yeah, it's definitely Pixarified a little bit. There's a little less I liken it to like King of the Hill or like early Simpsons, where it's like, this looks kind of bad, but it's funny. Like for comedy, I do think it helps to like look a little janky or bad. And this is a lot more cute. Like that Muppet guy, I do really like his design.
Yeah.
Is there like does this feel like there's like was something lost between the first and second one in terms of like there's like a shine to the second one in just like I don't know, because there was something like old and janky, like kind of like a Ren and Stimpy, like things are kind of almost gross looking in the first one, that kind of just gets like cleaned out in the second one with like the more like Unreal Engine like visuals of it. Whereas like it has to be 3D, fully 3D, and like I don't know. I don't know enough about this stuff, but it's just like there's like a cleanliness to it that that wasn't there in the first one.
Yeah, I don't know if that's a product of the setting of so much of it taking place in the Mother Lobe, which is, a shinier, more like professional looking environment, because I don't know if it's that or something else, because they have like, I mean, with maybe the exception of like some of the other people actually making art assets for this game, just knowing from what we know about from the doc, they had a lot of the same artists work on this. Scott Campbell, Peter Chan, Bagel, and so it's a lot of the same. Maybe they just had like a different sense of how clean this was going to be, or maybe that's something that's not covered of like a directive given. I don't know.
I think it's also just a harder style to pull off when it's so high res and high fidelity.
Yeah.
And especially like the kind of contrast between environment and character, it didn't feel like, oh, they don't fit together. But at the same time, it's like you kind of got these weirdo looking creatures that are your main characters.
Yeah.
And then in this environment that's very stylized, but also like feels super polished and super like bright and clean. instead of this kind of like, yeah, everything's a little muddy, a little grungy, a little low res, and it just all works together because of that.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense. Nick or Teo, is there an element of this game that we haven't brought up or that you haven't got to touch on yet that you want to highlight? Maybe Nick, I'll turn to you first.
Element of the game we haven't got to touch on.
Or even
No,
something you haven't brought up that you felt like chatting about.
I mean, we got to talk about the doc before we're done. That's all I'm
of
thinking
course.
about.
I'll save a section for that, for sure.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, nothing else.
Okay. Teo, how about you? Any element that's sort of lingering you want to discuss or like something you haven't got to add on to?
We got to talk about the doc.
Cool. Before we do, I mean, this is all tied together. I do want to just sort of like wrap up our thoughts on this game and put a bow for each of us on kind of like an overall thesis on this game. I'll start for us. I was like, last night I like sat down with my notebook and I was like, I really want to think about this critically and so that I come in prepared for what I want to say. And I'm going to be echoing a lot of what I said previously, which is I really was captured by the first game last year. Like it really won me over by the charm. The charm of it is the greatest strength. And I think that for this game, despite some of the like highs and lows of that are experienced, or some of the strengths that it doesn't have compared to the first, of like Ryan, I know we've been repeating ourselves, but talking about the high highs and the low lows of some of those brains in that first one. And the improvements of gameplay to this, I think for me, like walking away from this game, like I was totally won over by it. My first experience playing it, the spirit of it, I think really still stuck around despite it being obvious that there were, I don't know, what was it, like 15 years, 16 years between releases of this series. So it makes sense that things are different, but I still was like really captured by it, despite constantly through the game seeing and experiencing things, whether it's gameplay or a moment here and there that bumped for me. For the most part, like this was a really special experience that I had, and like I soaked up every minute of it for me personally. Nick, can you sort of like wrap up your thoughts on Psychonauts 2 leaving today?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it is a game that has plenty of flaws and plenty of things you look at and you're like, oh, I wish, why didn't they do this different? And we've talked about so many of those. But at the end of the day, it's just so fun to be able to kind of dive back into these characters, dive back into this world. And the places I'm left wanting are the places where it's just like, I love this world so much. I wish we could do more with it. But it's still a delight to get to play it. And I love the first time I played it, I loved it. The replay was great. I think it's a game that I'll continue to have fond memories of.
Cool. Teo, how about you? Overall thoughts on Psychonauts 2?
An incredibly well-crafted game by artists and creators at the top of their field, but it's ultimately, I think, not for me. The doc, though, very much for me.
Oh, we're almost there. Ryan, will you wrap up your thoughts on the game itself for us?
Yeah, on inside the NBA, Shaq will always be so mean to big guys,
Mm-hmm.
and
Yes.
it's because he's like Rudy Gobert is the worst player of all time, which is just like not true. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? But I think as someone who is like, damn, he clearly is like, I know what this could be. And I think all of my criticisms today are like similar to Nick. I played this day one, and I really, if Psychonauts 3 were to come out, maybe I'd give it 2 days to wait for reviews before buying it, but I would still play it. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
This is a franchise that I love, and all my criticisms and frustrations and even thoughts of like how I could improve the game are all due from just being like clearly enamored with it.
Yep.
So I don't come away from this with like hate in my heart. It's all just like, come on, big man, you got to back him down better than that.
Yes. Yeah, I did not expect to have an inside the NBA comparison on this episode, but I love it. And yeah, that's where I fall a lot too, is like I had plenty of of like, even if people go back and watch my streams on my Twitch channel, like plenty of times you'll see me have like be like nitpicking or being frustrated, and it's just echoing Ryan. It's only because I really loved this thing and was like, I could see I want it to be the best version. So thank you. And thank you all for sharing your thoughts about this game and talking about it with me. We talked a lot about the documentary on the first episode, but we're going to just go ahead and open it up again here. Teo, you were talking about how like this is probably your favorite Double Fine product, period, is Psych Odyssey. Do you have any additional thoughts or something you wanted to bring up about it today?
I think it's incredibly, I guess, brave to put out like a pretty, like, obviously there's things that they can't show and probably bad moments they don't want to show, but it's like a pretty raw look at like a bunch of people creating something that took uh 6 years to make. It's such a insightful, cool experience to kind of just be a fly on the wall of like all of these meetings, and it's ultimately like a showcase of like, how do you organize things, or how do you like organize people together to do something? And it's a really hard thing to do.
Yeah, especially like having rewatched this thing and it feeling very fresh in my mind, just the clash of the like Double Fine culture and how they go about making games versus, other really talented, experienced game professionals coming in from with a completely different expectation of how things are supposed to run. That clash was like so apparent, and knowing, having rewatching the doc and knowing what's to come, it's so different. It's like rewatching a movie and knowing, oh, that is going to be a long-standing issue. It's not going to be something they're ever going to figure out here in this relationship. Was so interesting. Nick, you we haven't really heard from you too much about the doc. What do you want to say? Do you want to like piggyback on anything we've already shared?
Yeah, I mean, on top of what Teo said, I think it is just this kind of remarkable historical artifact, not only of like what was it like to make a game in this period in history, because that's changing constantly. But then especially to have the pandemic happen right in the middle of this, and just as a record of like what was the experience of in so many industries of trying to do this thing in an entirely new way while dealing with this insane event. Yeah, I just think it's the remarkable piece of filmmaking that is going to be important for a long time.
Yeah. It's so, outside of even being interested in, game development and whatnot, like it's just it's like as entertaining of a reality show as you can kind of get over like 32 episodes or whatever. I found myself revisiting this, and finishing the whole thing with the final episode, sort of debriefing the doc. It's strange. My overall feelings and opinions aren't too different than when I left the first one. I think watching it again, though, what really happened was like it just feels like I have more depth to my not understanding of what happened, but I see more of the humanity of everyone, whether it be character flaws and things that definitely should have, in my opinion, been done a lot differently at the studio, or empathizing more with a character like Teo's man, Zach. Just empathizing more with Zach, but also seeing like not being able to let go of like abrasiveness, or maybe Tim being a little too like close to the vest about stuff for too long and slowing down the means of production. So I kind of leave feeling the same, like so similarly about everything as I did the first time, just with more. It's almost like I read a book a second time and there are details that I missed, or things that are coloring in just feelings for me a little more. Ryan, is there anything you want to say about this dang 32-part documentary?
So I haven't rewatched recently, but something that jumps to mind is I really romanticize and kind of strive. I feel like creatively, I really, yeah, romanticize is the word. The Tim Schafer shutting the door, sticky note, like, do not come in, I'm writing. And like, I think he's so talented, but I do think it's so interesting just in work in general, when you're so good at that, when you get to a level of managing people, like the amount that you're doing that and your ability to do that well is also taking away from your ability to make the whole company like smooth over all these things that are happening outside of that shut door. So it's just interesting, you know what I mean? Like to be able to write at LucasArts these incredible games and create a career and make your own studio and be like, I'm doing everything that I want. But at a certain point, the thing that you're really good at kind of gets in the way of the thing that makes the company run.
Yeah, big time. Just so many things too. You talk about like go ahead, Nick.
Well, I was just gonna, I think, kind of chiming in on what you said, Connor, and definitely on what Ryan said. I think having watched the epilogue episode and then rewatched a bit of the start of the whole doc again before we recorded, was really struck with how much some of these characters that you have this very surface level appreciation of, so like Tim Schafer being someone who creatively I've always been very inspired by. And then the doc is a pretty honest picture of a lot of his flaws. And you kind of walk away being like, all right, yeah, talented writer, but exactly like Ryan said, at the same time, it takes more than that. And especially Zach, I think rewatching part of the doc, having this much different feeling for Zach, where I really saw him in the first time I watched just as kind of this like barged his way in, didn't fit in, was mean to everybody, and like thank God they finally got rid of him. And watching again, being like, wow, what a hard position he was put in. And there are moments where I watch, I'm like, well, you need to be a better manager. Like people management is a art that's really important to get stuff done, and I don't think he's a master of that. But at the same time, trying to like wrangle this huge project and try to deliver it, being told the job is like, we have to ship this one on time without crunch. And like, those are our goals, while also being in this studio that does not operate in a way that does that. I think kind of echoing what you said, Connor, just having a lot more appreciation for the humanity and the challenge of that position.
Yeah, and it's like all dimensions of that humanity. I feel like that I really find myself appreciating more, both the effort and like, all the I guess experience that he and others brought in, but also the other side of like just seeing those flaws of like, do you hear how you're talking to these people right now? And like, and I don't know if you do, maybe that flies somewhere else, but it's just, yeah, both sides of that. And I'm really a big both sides guy. I hope you all know. Anytime I can talk about two sides of an issue, I love doing it. But yeah, they just came out with a Blu-ray set of this, and I'm really tempted to buy it because I just like also leave this thing again being so fascinated and wondering if we're ever gonna get like something like this again. I assumed, well, two-player was not folded into, but they essentially just work with Double Fine now, I think is kind of how it works. But I hope that we get another doc on the next thing that they're making. But
yeah,
we'll
I can't imagine any other company doing this, especially to not have it just be like basically PR.
Yes.
As like some sanitized version of what happened.
Yeah. I can't believe that, because they were required by Microsoft before this thing came out, that Microsoft was like, or Xbox Game Studios was like, yeah, you can keep doing this. Like, I'm surprised they're not wanting it to be more closely pressed. But
my curiosity, Tao, you mentioned the epilogue, like feeling vindicated. I didn't watch the epilogue. Can you
Yeah, there are parts where because in the epilogue, people reflect on actually watching the entire series themselves, and they're like, that people say in moments like, oh yeah, Zach was being a good project lead in these moments, and it's weird seeing that. There's a part where James, the newbie level designer, like talked about like watching the moment where like Tim Schafer's like, I don't want to hire him, and Zach's like, okay, well, I think we should give him a shot, and I can fire him if he's bad. I don't know, to like defend Zach more, but also like clearly he does seem very condescending. I would say the majority of the reasons why he didn't succeed, I would probably attribute to like Tim, and like his doing, or his lack of like clear project lead, or like clear, like this is the person that should be making the decisions.
That was so muddy for so long.
It's so muddy for so long. And I also see like, yeah, like there's probably some level of like an agreement here where if you're hiring Zach to run this sequel to a game where you guys are all openly talking about how the first one was like a chaotic mess, and Zach is coming in from like Ubisoft or wherever, he's like some giant game company where they have a lot more process. So it's like, okay, I feel like the underlying agreement here is like, okay, well, there needs to be some organizational changes in order to make this not a shit show. And I feel like that's like kind of the thought he had. And then it's also like people were talking about how it was probably too much of a culture shift too fast, where Zach comes in, hires a bunch of like people that he's worked with at giant game studios, and then they all come in, and now like basically the main friction seems to be like design is clashing with every other department, where they are making all the decisions and all the other teams are like, well, what the hell, with this is very much like a bottoms up company. No one team is like in charge of everything for a game. That's that's not like right or wrong. I don't think, it all depends on like where, and it's probably Zach's mistake to like do that so fast and not really consider like all the changes and stuff. But like I feel like that is the like kind of mandate that he had in his head with like kind of the agreement of him being hired in the first place. So I don't know. Yeah.
It's a very interesting thing, I think, for video games specifically, because I think of like games made by one, like an Undertale, a Stardew. Like if you were to give that game a sequel with a team, maybe I'm just talking on my ass, but I'm like, I think it's a worse game. Like there is an element of Psychonauts being a better game from a unified vision. And unfortunately, that obviously promotes crunch and like people getting killed making this fucking game. But like when you bring in someone from the outside to like, let's make Stardew's fishing better, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
of course that could be better, but I think you do lose something in the original vision.
I think there's the version where it's like kind of like getting into like movies and like auteur theory is like everything really behind like one person's vision. I feel like there is like being bottoms up with all of your ideas probably leads to crunch. I think, because they talk about how in the epilogue, like really what was in Psychonauts 2 was everything that was made in the last like year of development. Right. Everything else is kind of basically thrown away or fully revamped. And I think that is probably from like, okay, well, everyone pitches in and does their own thing, and then we'll see what happens. Obviously, there's like versions where if it's one person at the helm making every just single decision, maybe their whims, what they think their vision of the game is changes all the time, and that leads to a bunch of crunch because people have to change the stuff. But I don't know. I feel like all the crunch discussions too in the episode are really interesting because I feel like they are that Delphine in particular is like, I don't know if you can avoid crunch for you all as a company where it is a bunch of people who care a lot and are also given freedom to like, make your thing really good. There's one person in the doc who was like, I worked really long nights because there is no gray area. It was like the guy who made the camera system, where there is no like, this is done. It's how good can I make this? So there is no endpoint for that.
Yes. And
you just work late nights because you really care about it. But like that stuff trickles down. So it's just like, I don't know, like all the talk about crunch, I'm like, I don't know if you as a company actually, you can, I think they are not like forcing it upon people for sure. And they're not exploiting people, but there is like a self-driven crunch, I think, at a company like that.
And then in a creative endeavor where you care about the output. Yeah.
Yeah.
I do think though also like the like crunch is and that experience of, okay, the game you see is really the last year of stuff. I think a lot of that with this game, my take from seeing the documentary is it came from kind of like starting going full steam without actually knowing what they were trying to make. And even from a writing point of view, when you watch it and it's like they have this kind of big plot figured out that from early on is very close to what we see in the end. But the brains themselves, you know, they go into design. Yeah. And to your point earlier, Ryan, about the like questionable area, kind of feeling like a waste of resources, they put all their like most senior design and programming talent building out this kind of like bonus area in the hub world that doesn't really do much. And then they take their most junior level designer and say, we have no script, no strong concept, no like even sketches yet of what this first brain should be. Please go figure it out. And it just felt like that's the stuff where if they had kind of upfront, if Tim had had that vision or the team had had a process to build a vision for like, these are the brains we care about. We're going to start with these ones. We're going to put our best resources there. Let the junior people learn from those examples. You would have been in a totally different place where like, yeah, or from early on, they would have had traction that I just think they didn't until they had like made and thrown away a bunch of stuff.
Totally.
Yeah, big time. It's especially rewatching it. It's so easy to see too when you know where that train is heading. It's like, and which is probably like a lot of things in life. With some perspective, is it just really fills that in and helps inform like your next step if you were to do something else a second time. Like I'm sure. I wonder how much they're going to learn from this doc moving forward because they're making something else. They talk about it in the epilogue. They're working on it. Several ideas, I think, and one in particular that this team is starting to grow. So we shall see.
Well, I mean, one of the things that Tim did say in the epilogue was, and this is where it's like, this is originally your fault for this happening, is they're never going to hire an outside person to lead a project, which is like, yeah, like Zach is doomed to start by being like some person from Ubisoft,
yes,
totally. Leading a like Tim Schafer game.
Yes.
Yeah, big time. So we'll see. Like seems like he's letting off the reins a little bit in that giving a little more leadership to other people there as like, you know, project leads, but who's to say? This has been such a fun discussion, guys. Thanks for talking about the documentary again, Double Fine Psych Odyssey, and discussing Psychonauts 2 with me today. This has been a blast. On our way out, though, I want to just like say thank you to each of you and give you some chance to plug. But truly, guys, thanks so much for taking the time to do this today. This was fun, and also just so fun for me to get to follow up our first episode from last year. Nick, I can't believe we got you for this one, pal. Thanks for doing this. What do you want to plug?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I will plug our game, which I'm sure you will plug again when people can actually go wishlist it and download it and do all the fun things that you like to do with games. Because right now, all we can do is tell you it's going to be great. And I'll let you pitch it again when we're ready to show it to the world. But yeah, beyond that, just been so fun to talk with you all. And thanks for having me.
You betcha. And yeah, can't wait to share more stuff about that. Hopefully, you know, in the coming months, we'll see. Should be exciting stuff. Tao Yang, thanks for being here, dude. What do you want to plug on your way out?
Oh, check me out.
Figuring it
out. Some stuff on dropout.tv. Check me out, Herald Night, UCB, Monday nights, Power of Attorney.
With the best team, Power of Attorney. So
what are we gonna do? Wow. Hey, wow. You said it.
Kara made me, I mean, Kara was like, I saw Kara last night. Kara's like, we're Connor's favorite team. And I was like, my favorite team and the best team.
Wow.
Ryan Creamer, my liege, thanks for doing this again. What do you want to plug today?
Thanks for having me. This is great. Yeah, Game Changer on Dropout is a fun game-related thing. If you haven't seen it, Teos makes appearances. It's a fun time. We're a shoot next month, so it won't be the new season won't be out until next year, but it's good stuff.
Hell yeah. Well, thank you. I'll go ahead and close this podcast out with about 1,000 plugs of my own. And again, anything that's been plugged today, you can find a link in the show notes wherever you're listening. This cover art for Call Me By Your Game is done by Glenn J. You can find him and his great work on Instagram at Glenn with 2 N's .jay. This show is produced, edited, and the original music is by Jeremy Schmidt. If you want to thank him for his hard work on this podcast, you can listen to his show, Video Games, a Comedy Show, wherever you get your podcasts. You can follow the show, Call Me By Your Game, and our podcast network, Super NPC Radio all over social media. We've got links to our Instagrams, our Twitters, our Blue Skies. If we've got a TikTok for a couple of these, our Twitch channels, there's links in the show notes to that. For me, you can follow me on social media as well. Come follow me on Twitch at twitch.tv/consiscool69, where I played through this whole game. There might even still be the on-demand video versions of my streams, the entire playthrough on there. And then lastly, this episode is originally released as a Patreon exclusive for our engineer Toads, at least the audio version. So if you're listening to this on Patreon, thank you so much for supporting us. I hope you look forward to our game that we're covering for next month's co-op episode sequel, and that is Uncharted 2, which I'm also playing for the first time. So thank you. If you're listening to this in the future on a public feed or on YouTube, thank you as well. Share the show with a friend. That would go a long way if you could just share the YouTube channel or wherever you're listening. Let someone else know that you like it. It's really all I can ask. But that'll do it for another episode of Call Me By Your Game Co-op Edition. Thanks for listening to our discussion on Psychonauts 2. We will see you on the next one.